Eleanor Ashford set her teacup down without a sound, and in that silence, every person at the breakfast table felt it. Rebecca's words still hung in the air like smoke. Womb, fortune, bargain, not a wife, never a wife. Eleanor did not cry. She had learned early that tears only gave cruel people something to remember. But across the table, Nathaniel slowly placed down his knife. The sound of silver on porcelain was the quietest thing she had ever heard, and somehow the most dangerous. If this story reaches your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey to the very end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1817 came to Virginia like a verdict. Hot, certain, and unforgiving, Ashford Hall had stood for 3 generations on the edge of the Shenandoah Valley. Its white columns catching the morning light the way old money always does, quietly and without apology. The estate stretched across 400 acres of tobacco fields, apple orchards, and tenant farmland. It was the kind of place that made visitors feel small on purpose. Eleanor Whitmore Ashford had lived inside those walls for 6 months. 6 months of formal dinners, where she was introduced as the Boston bride. 6 months of morning breakfasts, where the silverware gleamed brighter than any conversation. 6 months of learning that when people said welcome to the family, what they meant was, we are watching to see what you produce. She had not yet produced anything they considered worthy. No child, no heir, no proof that the Ashford bloodline would continue past Nathaniel's generation. And Virginia society, she had learned, kept very precise records of a woman's failures. The breakfast room that morning smelled of black coffee and beeswax. Sunlight came in hard through the tall east windows. 3 servants stood at their stations along the wall, still as furniture, trained to hear nothing. Rebecca Ashford sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, cutting her ham with the careful precision of a woman who considered everything she did a performance. She was 41, handsome in the way that cold things sometimes are, and she had run Ashford Hall for 4 years, between their mother's death and Nathaniel's marriage. She had done it well. She had done it with pleasure. And she had never not once considered that Eleanor might be asked to do it instead. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table reading the morning's correspondence. He was a quiet man by nature, not cold exactly, but contained. The kind of man who kept everything useful and released nothing unnecessary. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he had married Eleanor Whitmore of Boston because 2 fathers and a shared investment in a shipping route had decided it was practical. Eleanor had known that going in. She was not a foolish woman. She sat to Nathaniel's right, her tea untouched, her hands folded in her lap. She had a letter of her own on the table from her father in Boston, arrived that morning, full of warmth and commerce in equal parts. She had not opened it yet. She had been watching Rebecca's face for the past 10 minutes, and a woman who watches carefully enough always knows when something is coming. It came. Rebecca set down her fork. "I have been thinking," she said, in the tone she used when she had been planning, not thinking, "that it is time we spoke honestly." Nathaniel turned a page of his correspondence. He said. Rebecca's eyes moved to Eleanor. They were pleasant eyes, which made them worse. Eleanor. The name in her mouth sounded like a notation in a ledger. "We have all been extraordinarily patient. 6 months is not so long, I understand. But the family, the extended family, the cousins, the Hargrove side, the people with actual interest in this estate's future, they are beginning to ask questions." Eleanor kept her hands folded. "What sort of questions?" "The sort that have to be asked." Rebecca reached for her coffee. "My brother did not marry for love. That was never the arrangement. He married to secure the next generation of Ashfords. You came with your father's shipping money and your Boston manners, and we accepted that arrangement because the estate needed both. But an arrangement requires 2 parties to perform their function." The word landed like a stone in still water. Function. Eleanor felt it move through her, down her throat, into her chest, settling somewhere behind her ribs, where she kept the things she did not allow herself to say at breakfast tables. "My function," Eleanor repeated. "You are a married woman. Rebecca said with a small, patient smile. "In a house that needs an heir, I do not think I am being unkind by naming the obvious." She glanced toward the servants, then back. "Let us stop pretending. My brother did not marry a wife. He married a womb with a fortune attached." The room did something rooms do sometimes when a sentence is too large for the air inside them. It went absolutely still. One of the servants near the sideboard shifted his weight. A small sound, a heel against floorboard, and then silence again. Eleanor looked at her teacup. There was steam rising from it, slow and thin. She had a sudden and specific desire to pick it up with both hands and feel the heat of it against her palms, just to feel something solid. She did not. She had learned very young, growing up in a merchant's house in Boston, that the most powerful thing a woman could do in a room full of people waiting for her to break was to refuse to break. But then the sound. Silver on porcelain. Deliberate. Final. Nathaniel had set down his knife. Everyone looked at him. He was already standing. He hadn't pushed the chair back loudly or moved with any urgency. He had simply stood, the way a tree stands in a field, as if it had always been standing there and you had only just noticed. His face was unreadable. That was the most frightening thing about it. "Rebecca," he said. She turned to him with a smile still arranged on her mouth, the kind of smile that assumed he was about to agree with her. "You will leave this table," he said. The smile held for a moment by sheer will. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me." His voice was quiet, not raised, not shaking. It was the voice of a man who did not need volume to be understood. "You will leave this table. You will go to your rooms, and you will not return to this dining room until you are prepared to speak to my wife with the same courtesy you demand for yourself." Rebecca stared at him. "Nathaniel, You were only telling my wife in front of the household staff that her value is biological." He reached for his coffee cup calmly and took one slow sip before setting it down. "That is not honesty, Rebecca. That is cruelty dressed in housekeeping language, and I will not have it at my table. The estate is my concern. Still quiet, still cold as river water. Not yours." Rebecca's chin came up. "I have managed this family You managed this house while I was away." He nodded once like he was acknowledging a debt already paid. "And I am grateful for it. But you do not manage this marriage, and you do not manage my wife, and you do not get to sit at my table and reduce her to a function while she is sitting 3 feet away from you." He finally looked at Rebecca with something that Eleanor recognized as carefully controlled fury, not because it showed on his face, but because it didn't. "Leave before sundown, please. Take what you need. Mrs. Leland will arrange for the rest to follow." The silence that followed was the heaviest silence Eleanor had ever sat inside. Rebecca stood. Her face had gone through something complicated. Surprise first, then a flash of real hurt, then the closing over that proud people do when they cannot afford to let pain show. She folded her napkin. She set it on the table with great precision. She walked past Nathaniel without looking at him, and when she passed Eleanor's chair, she paused for just a moment. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. Rebecca moved on. The door closed. The 3 servants stood at their posts, looking at exactly nothing. Nathaniel sat back down. He picked up his correspondence. He appeared to be reading it. Eleanor stared at her teacup. After a long moment, she said, "You did not have to do that." He turned a page. "Yes, I did." "She'll tell everyone you chose me over your own blood. She can tell them whatever she likes." He set one letter aside and picked up another. "It happens to be true." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. She had come to Virginia prepared for a great many things. She had prepared for loneliness. She had prepared for disapproval and cool dinners and the specific kind of isolation that comes from being a stranger in a house where everyone else already knows the rules. She had prepared for a husband who was courteous but distant, who fulfilled his obligation to her name and her father's money, and very little else. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for him to look at his sister across a polished table in front of the servants and choose her. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. She wanted to ask him something. She wasn't sure what it was yet. She wanted to ask whether he'd always felt that way, or whether this morning had surprised him too. She wanted to ask why he'd waited 6 months to defend her, or if this was the first time it had truly required defending. She wanted to ask whether the word wife, when he used it, meant what it was starting to mean to her, or whether it was still just a word for the woman at the end of his table. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. Not the quick, polite acknowledgement she'd grown used to, longer than that. The way a person looks at something they're seeing for the first time, even though it's been there all along. "You're welcome," he said, and went back to his correspondence. The gossip started before Rebecca's trunks were loaded. It moved the way Virginia gossip always moved through the kitchens first, then to the tenant farmers, then to the outer edges of society, carried in hushed voices and careful pauses that communicated everything, while saying almost nothing. By the following Wednesday, Eleanor had been invited to exactly 0 of the 3 social calls she would normally have received. By the following Friday, she received a letter from Mrs. Hargrove, a cousin on Nathaniel's mother's side, formidable and sharp-eyed, that did not ask after her health so much as inquire whether there were marital difficulties at Ashford Hall, and whether the family should be prepared for uncertainty regarding succession. Eleanor sat with the letter in the small upstairs parlor she'd claimed as her own, the one with the better morning light and the view over the kitchen garden, and she read it twice. Then she went downstairs, found the household ledger in the estate office, and opened it to the last recorded entry. She had been married 6 months. She had sat at Nathaniel's table, walked through Nathaniel's rooms, slept in a bed surrounded by Nathaniel's family history, and she had never once been invited to look at the actual business of the house she lived in. She turned to the page recording food stores. She found a shortfall that had apparently been ongoing for 2 years. She turned to the tenant accounts. She found 3 families who had been overcharged for the repair of a mill house that, based on the dates, had never actually been repaired. She turned to the servants' wages. She found 4 positions listed on the books that did not correspond to any name she could put to a face in this household. She was still reading when the door opened and Nathaniel came in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up. "Did you know there are 4 ghost wages being drawn from the household accounts?" A pause. "No," he said. "Did you know there's a family in the East Tenant Quarter who's been paying repair costs for a mill house that burned down before it was ever fixed?" Another pause, slightly longer. "No," he said again. Eleanor turned to the next page. "Your sister managed this house for 4 years, Nathaniel. She managed it in a particular way." She kept her voice level, not accusatory, just clear. "Someone has been drawing funds from these accounts for purposes that aren't recorded anywhere I can find." He came in then. Came and stood at her shoulder and looked at the page she had open. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant something was moving through him that he wasn't going to name yet. "How did you find this?" he asked. "I went looking," she said simply. "I didn't have anything else to do this morning." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me you knew how to do this?" Eleanor considered the question. She looked at the ledger. She thought about 6 months of breakfast tables and polite silences, and being shown to rooms and never once asked what she thought about anything. "You didn't ask," she said. Nathaniel was still for a moment. Then he reached past her and turned to the beginning of the ledger, the earliest entries from years before his father's death, and set it open between them. "Show me," he said, "everything you found." And Eleanor began. There was a moment much later when the candles had burned low and the account books were spread across 3/4 of the desk, and Nathaniel had removed his coat and rolled his sleeves and was making his own notes in the margin that Eleanor looked sideways at the man she had married and thought, "I did not know you at all." Not in a sorrowful way. In the way of someone standing at the edge of something large looking down and finding it less frightening than expected. He caught her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "A question I'm not sure how to ask." He set his pen down. "Try." She looked at the ledger, then at her hands, then finally at him. "That morning," she said. At breakfast. With Rebecca. She paused. You sent her away. You chose... She stopped. Tried again. Was that about the estate, about keeping order, or was it... It was about you, he said. Just that. No elaboration. No softening. Eleanor breathed. All right, she said. He picked his pen back up. All right, he agreed. Outside, the Shenandoah Valley was dark and warm and still. The tobacco fields breathed in the summer heat. Somewhere in the kitchen garden below, something moved through the lavender. Eleanor dipped her pen and turned to the next page. And for the first time in 6 months inside Ashford Hall, she did not feel like a function. She felt like a person who had somewhere to be. Rebecca's trunks were gone before the afternoon heat broke. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window not out of cruelty, but because she needed to see it with her own eyes to believe it had actually happened. 3 trunks, 2 hat boxes, and the small rosewood writing desk that Rebecca had always kept in the east sitting room and apparently considered personally hers. A hired carriage. No farewell. Nathaniel did not watch. He was already back in the estate office by noon, and when Eleanor passed the open door on her way to the kitchen garden, she saw him at his father's old desk with a stack of correspondence and the corrected ledger pages she had left beside the inkwell. He didn't look up. But he had moved her pages to the top of the stack. She noticed that. She noticed it the way a woman who has learned not to expect much notices, the smallest things carefully quietly turning them over like coins she isn't sure are real. The first letter arrived 3 days later. It came from Mrs. Hargrove, as expected, the Ashford cousin who had already written once about marital uncertainties and succession concerns. This time, the letter was longer, and the language was more particular. It expressed sorrow over Rebecca's sudden departure and concern that Ashford Hall appeared to be undergoing changes of a most irregular nature. It inquired whether Nathaniel was in good health. It noted with delicate cruelty that several members of the family had been praying for news of a happy addition and hoped the summer months would bring cause for celebration. Eleanor read it at the breakfast table. Nathaniel was eating. She passed it to him without comment. He read it, set it down, poured himself more coffee. Burn it, he said. Eleanor looked at him. Or don't, he added. Keep it if you want a record, but don't answer it. Ignoring her will only make her louder. She's already at full volume. He picked up his fork. Responding teaches her that volume works. Eleanor thought about that for a moment. Then she folded the letter, set it aside, and reached for the butter. It was the most honest conversation they'd had over breakfast since the morning Rebecca left. She found herself wanting more of them. That was the thing no one had prepared her for. Not her mother, not her aunts, not the women in Boston who had sat with her before the wedding and offered their collected wisdom about marriage and men and managing a household with grace. None of them had mentioned the specific particular hunger of wanting to be known by the person sitting across from you at breakfast. Wanting to be known and not just acknowledged. Not just managed. Not just tolerated. She was beginning to think Nathaniel might be capable of more than toleration. She was not yet sure what to do with that. The gossip, meanwhile, was getting worse. She heard it first from Mrs. Abigail Reed, her lady's maid, small and sharp and loyal in the particular way of women who have decided to attach their allegiance to someone and have chosen well. Abigail had ears that caught things other ears missed, and a mouth that only opened for Eleanor. They're saying you turned him against his own blood. Abigail said one morning while pinning Eleanor's hair, that you used your father's money to buy his loyalty. That Rebecca was the one keeping this house together, and you've driven her out so you can take control of everything before... She paused. Before it becomes clear I can't give him an heir, Eleanor finished. Abigail's hand stilled. I'm sorry, ma'am. Don't be. I'd rather hear it from you than find out they've been saying it for weeks while everyone around me pretends not to know. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror. She looked calm. She had gotten very good at looking calm. Who's saying it? Mrs. Hargrove's circle mostly. But it's spreading. Of course it is. Eleanor breathed. What else? Abigail hesitated. There's talk that the Ashford cousins, the Hargrove side, have begun consulting with a lawyer in Richmond about the estate entailment. Eleanor went very still. Say that again. If there's no direct heir, and if they can argue that the marriage was entered under false pretenses. Abigail stopped. They'd try to challenge the estate, Eleanor said. Not a question. Abigail said nothing, which was its own answer. Eleanor sat with that for the rest of the morning. She sat with it through the kitchen garden, and through the tenant ledger review, and through the quiet lunch she ate alone because Nathaniel had ridden out to the North Fields before noon. She sat with it until she could hold the full shape of it in her mind without flinching. False pretenses. There was a letter. There had always been a letter. It had arrived from a Boston physician 2 years before her marriage after the fever that had kept her bedridden for 6 weeks in the winter of 1815. The doctor had been careful in his language, possible complications, not certain, only something to be aware of going forward. Not a diagnosis, not a verdict. A caution. She had read it 3 times, put it in the bottom of her correspondence box, and told no one. She had told no one because she was 23 years old and frightened, and because the only thing a woman in her position feared more than being unable to have children was having that fear used as a reason to be discarded before anyone had even tried to know her. She had told no one, and she had carried it into this marriage like a stone in a pocket, heavy and cold, and she had told herself that caution was not certainty, and that she owed no one a letter from a physician about a possibility that might never become a reality. She still believed that, but sitting in the parlor with the summer light going long across the floor, and the sound of the Hargrove lawyer's name in her mind, she understood something new. The letter existed, and it was in her correspondence box, and if it was ever found by someone who wanted to use it, the damage would not be to the estate. The damage would be to Nathaniel. That was the thought that moved her. Not fear for herself. Fear for him, for what it would look like, for the story people would tell about a man whose wife had withheld information that the family now considered material to the whole arrangement. They would say she had deceived him. They would say she was exactly what Rebecca had named her, a bargain that had failed to perform its function. She got up, went to her room, opened the correspondence box. The letter was still there at the very bottom, folded into thirds, the way she had folded it 2 years ago. She held it for a long time. Then she put it back, locked the box, and went downstairs to find Nathaniel. She did not find him. He had come home from the Northfields and gone directly to the office, and by the time she reached the hallway outside the door, she could hear voices, his and one she recognized after a moment as Mr. Calder, the estate solicitor, a thin and careful man who came from Richmond twice a year to review accounts. She stopped in the hallway. Through the door, clear and unhurried, she heard Calder say, "The Hargrove petition would require evidence of misrepresentation at the time of the marriage contract. They would need to demonstrate that information was knowingly withheld that materially affected the terms of the agreement." A pause. Nathaniel's voice. "And can they demonstrate that? That would depend on what information exists and who has access to it." Calder's tone was precise. "I'm not suggesting anything improper occurred. I'm explaining what they will attempt to argue." What would it take to stop them? A child would stop them. A pause. "Absent that absolute unity between you and your wife, any sign of distance, any suggestion that the marriage is troubled, or that either party has cause for grievance, they will use it. They are already watching Mr. Ashford." Eleanor stood very still in the hallway. She heard Nathaniel say, after a long moment, "Then they'll find nothing to watch." She walked away before she could hear anything else. She went to the kitchen garden and pulled weeds that didn't need pulling for 45 minutes until her hands were dirty and her mind was steady and she could breathe without it catching. He had said, "Then they'll find nothing to watch." Not "I'll deal with my wife." Not "I need to investigate." Not even "I'll handle Eleanor." He had said, "They'll find nothing," as if the two of them were already standing on the same side of something, as if there was a they and a we and he knew which one she was on. She pulled another weed. "She thought this man is more complicated than I gave him credit for. That evening, he found her on the back porch after supper, the long wooden porch that ran along the south face of the house where the air smelled like cut grass and something sweet from the kitchen garden. He brought 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking whether she wanted it. She accepted it without saying she'd already had one. They stood together in the kind of silence that was beginning to feel less empty. After a while he said, "I rode out to the pickets today." She looked at him. "East Tenant Quarter," he said. "The family you mentioned in the ledger. The ones who were charged for the mill house. And they've been paying that charge for 2 years." He drank his coffee. "I told them it was an error and that the amount would be credited against next quarter's rent." Eleanor held her cup with both hands. "How did they take it?" "Mrs. Pickett cried," he said, which was, "I wasn't expecting that." "She wasn't expecting honesty," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he agreed. "I suppose she wasn't." The night air moved between them. Somewhere in the orchard, something stirred leaves, or a bird, or just the dark shifting around. "I found 2 more irregularities in the West accounts today," Eleanor said. "I know. I saw your notes. I can go through the full 5-year records if you want. It would take a week, maybe 2. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her. The way he'd done that first morning over the correspondence, and once or twice since then, this long direct assessing look that was different from courtesy and different from affection, and was something she didn't quite have a word for yet. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Because this is my house." It came out steadier than she'd expected, more certain, as if some part of her had decided it before the rest of her had caught up. Something crossed Nathaniel's face, too fast to name but real. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He turned back to the dark orchard, and she turned back to the night air, and they stood there for another 10 minutes, in a silence that had changed its shape entirely from the one they'd started with. She didn't tell him about the letter. Not that night. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself it wasn't the right moment because she didn't fully understand yet what it would mean to tell him. She told herself a lot of careful, reasonable things that were all true, and none of which were the whole truth. The whole truth was that she was afraid, not of him, not of what he would do. She was afraid of the look that might come before he did anything, the look that she still didn't fully have evidence against. The look that might say, "I see. So that is what you are." She was afraid of becoming a category again. And she was very close for the first time in 6 months to feeling like something more than that. She was not willing to risk it yet. 3 days later, she made the mistake of going to the Hargrove estate for what she believed was a social call. She went because Mrs. Hargrove had sent a new letter, warmer this time, inviting, full of language about bridging any misunderstanding, and family is family, whatever the disagreements. Eleanor had shown it to Nathaniel. He had raised one eyebrow and said, "Your decision." She had decided to go because she was not a woman who avoided battles she could win in a drawing room. She did not win this one. Mrs. Hargrove was gracious and sharp and 70 years old, and had been navigating Virginia society since before Eleanor's parents were married. She served excellent tea. She asked after Nathaniel's health with genuine warmth. She remarked on Eleanor's gown with specific detailed admiration that was more unsettling than criticism would have been. And then, while pouring the second cup, she said, "You must understand, my dear, that none of this is personal. The family simply needs to know that Ashford Hall is in good hands, capable, reliable, productive hands." She smiled. "A house is only as sound as its future." Eleanor set down her cup. "Then the house is very sound, ma'am," she said. "I've been reviewing the estate accounts. There have been some irregularities in the management that are now being corrected. The tenants are better provided for than they were 6 months ago. The household staff is properly compensated. And the next harvest looks to be the strongest in 4 years." Mrs. Hargrove's smile held, but something shifted behind it. "That is impressive," she said carefully. "It's management," Eleanor said. Which is what a wife does, Mrs. Hargrove. She manages the house she was given. That is my function." She let the word land the way Rebecca had meant it to land, hard and deliberate. "And I intend to perform it very well." She left 30 minutes later. She rode home in the carriage with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw slightly aching from keeping her expression pleasant for a full hour, and when she walked into Ashford Hall and found Nathaniel in the hall looking at her with that question in his eyes, she said, "I went to see your cousin." "I know. How was it?" "Educational." She handed her bonnet to Abigail. "She's going to keep pushing." "Yes. She has a lawyer." "I know." Eleanor looked at him. "Then we need to be smarter than she is." Nathaniel looked back at her, and for the first time since she had come to live in his house, he smiled. Not the polite smile she was accustomed to, not the restrained half-expression of a man maintaining social form. A real one, brief and crooked and surprised out of him like it had gotten past his defenses before he could decide whether to allow it. "Come to the office," he said. "I have an idea." She followed him, and she thought, "I did not know this man at all." And this time the thought did not frighten her. This time it felt like standing at the edge of something large and finding against all expectation that she wanted to see what was at the bottom. The letter was still in her correspondence box. She had not forgotten it. But for the first time, she began to understand that what was growing between them might be strong enough someday to survive the weight of it. Someday. Not yet. The idea Nathaniel had was simpler than Eleanor expected and more dangerous. He wanted to open Ashford Hall, not to family, not to the Hargrove cousins or the Richmond lawyers or the extended network of people who had been watching and measuring and waiting. He wanted to open it to the county a midsummer dinner, the kind his father had hosted every year until his death, the kind that had stopped when Nathaniel took over the estate and decided he had no patience for performance. "You want to host a dinner," Eleanor said. "I want to show them a house in order." He set his pen down. "Right now they're working from rumors and Rebecca's version of events. Give them something else to look at. They'll still be looking for the same thing. Let them look." His jaw was set. They won't find what they're expecting. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove's careful tea and her precise smile, and the word productive, delivered like a blade wrapped in linen. She thought about the lawyer in Richmond and the letter in her correspondence box, and the weight she had been carrying since before this marriage had even begun. "All right," she said, "but I plan the dinner." He looked at her. "If we're doing this," she said, "we do it properly. Not your father's dinner, ours." Something moved across his face again, that same flash she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she surprised him. He nodded once. "Yours," he said. "I'll stay out of your way." She planned it in 10 days. She went through the kitchen stores, revised the menu, wrote 41 invitations in her own hand, reorganized the seating arrangements 3 times, and consulted with Abigail every morning over the guest list with the focus of a general reviewing a battlefield map. She invited the Hargroves. She invited the circuit judge and his wife. She invited 2 magistrates, a state assemblyman, 4 of the wealthiest landowners in the county, and every woman in the county society who had the kind of social influence that moved faster than lawyers. She also sent a letter to Rebecca. Nathaniel found out about it 2 days before the dinner, when Abigail mentioned it in his presence without realizing he didn't know. He came to find Eleanor in the parlor that evening. "You invited Rebecca," he said. "I did." "Why?" Eleanor looked up from the seating chart. "Because the story everyone is telling puts you against your own blood for the sake of a Boston wife with no children and questionable motives. The only way to change that story is to show them a different one." He was quiet for a moment. "And if she doesn't come, then she doesn't come. But I needed her to have the choice." Eleanor set the chart down. "This isn't about winning, Nathaniel. It's about what's true. And the truth is that I don't want to be the reason your family breaks apart." He looked at her for a long time. "She insulted you," he said, "in front of the whole household." "Yes." Eleanor met his eyes. "And you defended me." That matters more to me than winning a dinner table war with your sister." She paused. "Let me try this my way." He didn't argue. He also didn't sleep well that night. She could hear him moving through the house past midnight, down the hall, down the stairs, across the floorboards below her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of him not sleeping, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. There were several. The most significant one was still locked in her correspondence box. She had not told him. She kept deciding to tell him, and then arriving at the actual moment and finding the words stuck somewhere between her chest and her mouth, unable to cross that last distance. Every time she got close, she heard Mrs. Hargrove's voice, productive hands. She heard Rebecca, a womb with a fortune attached. And she understood with a clarity that was painful that the letter was not the problem. The problem was that she did not yet fully trust that she was more to him than the sum of what she could provide. She was getting there. She was not there yet. The dinner was on a Thursday. The guests began arriving at 4 o'clock, and by 6, the downstairs rooms were full of the sound of Virginia summer society in full performance voices, laughter, the particular music of expensive fabric, and practiced manners. Eleanor moved through it with Nathaniel at her side, and she watched the way people looked at them. They were looking for cracks. She knew how to make them find none. She had grown up in a merchant's house in Boston where her father had negotiated contracts over supper tables, and her mother had held the room together with warmth and precision in equal measure. Eleanor had inherited both skills. She remembered names. She asked after children and harvests and business ventures with genuine interest. She laughed at the right moments, and was serious at the right moments, and steered conversations away from dangerous ground so smoothly that most people didn't notice they'd been steered. Nathaniel stayed close, not in front of her, not behind her. Beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched when they turned to greet someone, close enough that when she reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, his hand briefly brushed hers and neither of them moved away. Mrs. Hargrove arrived at 5:30 with her husband and her lawyer, the lawyer she had not mentioned being invited but had apparently decided to bring anyway. Eleanor saw him the moment they came through the door. She recognized the type, thin, watchful, the kind of man who memorized rooms. She smiled and went to greet them. "Mrs. Hargrove, how wonderful you came." "My dear." The old woman looked around the room with an expression that managed to be both approving and calculating. "You've done beautifully. I wouldn't have thought well." She patted Eleanor's hand. "You surprise me." "I hope to keep doing that," Eleanor said pleasantly and moved on. Rebecca arrived at 6. Eleanor saw her from across the room and felt the entire dinner party shift a subtle thing. A collective breath held and redirected everyone pretending not to watch while watching with complete attention. Rebecca came in alone without her usual certainty of bearing, dressed in dark blue, and looking Eleanor was not prepared for this, looking uncertain. Not uncertain the way proud people sometimes look uncertain when they are planning to be certain again in a moment. Actually uncertain. Actually somewhere between the woman who had sat at that breakfast table with her precise smile and said womb and fortune and something else. Something quieter. Eleanor crossed the room. She heard Abigail inhale sharply behind her. She heard the conversation nearest to her drop by half a register. She walked to Rebecca Ashford and said, "I'm glad you came." Rebecca looked at her. For a moment she didn't speak. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were doing something complicated. "I wasn't sure I should," she said. "I know." Eleanor kept her voice low. "But I'm glad you did." Rebecca was quiet for another moment. Then she said in a voice that cost her something, "I owe you an apology. What I said at breakfast." "Not here," Eleanor said quietly. "Come find me later. We'll talk properly." She touched Rebecca's arm briefly, just a press of her fingers, and turned back to the room. Her heart was beating hard. She did not let it show. Nathaniel had watched the whole exchange from 15 feet away. When she returned to his side, he said nothing. But his hand found the small of her back just for a moment, just the briefest pressure, and she understood it for what it was. "Well done," She almost let herself be steadied by it. And then Mrs. Hargrove's lawyer cleared his throat. It was a deliberate sound, the kind a man makes when he has decided that the pleasantries have gone on long enough, and the real business of the evening should begin. He was standing near the fireplace with two of the older magistrates, and his voice carried with the particular confidence of a man used to courtrooms. "I wonder," he said, "whether this might be an appropriate moment to discuss the matter of the Ashford estate succession, given that so many of the relevant parties are present." The room did not go silent, but it tightened. Eleanor felt Nathaniel go very still beside her. The lawyer, his name was Mr. Dunmore, she had learned from Abigail, pressed on. "The family has certain legitimate concerns. The entailment is clear that in the absence of a direct heir—" "Mr. Dunmore," Nathaniel's voice was quiet, "you are a guest in my home. I represent the interests of—" "You represent the Hargrove family's interests," Nathaniel said, "which are not the same as the Ashford family's interests, and you were not invited to this dinner to conduct legal proceedings in my dining room." He looked at Mrs. Hargrove with an expression that was perfectly civil and absolutely immovable. "I'm sure you understand." Mrs. Hargrove, to her credit, looked briefly embarrassed. "Of course. Edward, this is not the place." Dunmore subsided. But his eyes moved to Eleanor as he did, and in them she read something that chilled her, a calculation, a question. As if he already knew something she hadn't admitted yet. She told herself it was her own fear-making patterns where there were none. She was wrong. She found out how wrong she was 20 minutes later. She had slipped away from the main room to check on the kitchen timing, the kind of hosting task that required 30 seconds of actual attention and provided a useful excuse for 2 minutes of quiet. She was coming back down the hallway when she heard voices from the small study off the east corridor. The door was not fully closed. She recognized Dunmore's voice immediately. She should have kept walking. She stopped. "The correspondence box," Dunmore was saying. The maid confirmed it arrived before the wedding. A letter from a Boston physician, the contents of which— The second voice, lower, female. Eleanor knew it before she placed it. Rebecca. "I know about the letter," Rebecca said. "Then you understand what it contains." A pause. "It changes everything." Dunmore's voice was careful, precise. "If Mrs. Ashford knew before the marriage that she might be unable to produce an heir, and if that information was not disclosed to Mr. Ashford or to the families involved in the marriage agreement, that is misrepresentation. A contract entered under misrepresentation can be challenged." Silence. Eleanor stood in the hallway with her hand against the wall and felt the floor change under her feet, not literally, but in the way things change when the ground you thought was solid turns out to be something less certain. She had been right to be afraid. She had just been afraid of the wrong people. "And you want me to confirm it?" Rebecca said. "I want you to consider what is best for the Ashford family." Another silence. Longer. Then Rebecca said slowly, "How did you know about the letter?" A member of the household staff was approached. By whom? It wasn't a question. It was the tone of a woman who had just realized she was not the only person in the room running a plan. Eleanor pressed herself back against the wall as the study door opened. Rebecca came out first. She stopped when she saw Eleanor. For one long, terrible moment, the two women looked at each other in the dim hallway, and Eleanor understood with the particular clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose by understanding that Rebecca had known about the letter for some time and had come to the dinner tonight, not knowing what she was going to do with that knowledge, and had just in the room behind her made a decision. Eleanor lifted her chin. "How long have you known?" she said. Rebecca's face was unreadable. "Long enough." "Are you going to give him what he wants?" A pause that lasted a very long time. Then Rebecca said very quietly, "I came to this dinner tonight to apologize to you." "I know." "I meant it. I know that too." Eleanor held her ground. "Rebecca, whatever you do next, whatever you decide about that letter, I need you to know something first." She kept her voice steady. "I didn't hide the letter to deceive your brother. I hid it because I was 23 years old and terrified that the only thing anyone would ever want from me was something I might not be able to give, and I have spent every day of this marriage carrying that fear while trying to be worth something beyond it." Rebecca said nothing. "Your brother has been more than I expected," Eleanor said. "More than I let myself hope for. And I am not going to ask you to protect me. That is not what this is." She breathed. "I am going to go back into that dining room, and I am going to tell him myself, tonight, before someone else does." Rebecca looked at her for a very long time. Then she said, "Dunmore is working for the Hargrove side, not the family. I want you to know that. Whatever my concerns about the estate, I am not their instrument." She walked past Eleanor toward the dining room. Eleanor stood in the hallway. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the sides of her skirt and breathed until they stopped. She had 7 minutes maybe before Dunmore found another way to use what he knew. She walked back into the dining room and found Nathaniel near the window with the circuit judge half listening to something about county road maintenance with the patient expression he used when he was waiting for a conversation to end. She touched his arm. He looked at her immediately. Something in her face made him excuse himself without hesitation. "What happened?" he said low. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Not here, not with 40 people in the room, but soon, before the evening ends." His eyes searched her face. "Are you all right?" "I will be." She held his gaze. "I need you to trust me for the next 2 hours. Can you do that?" He looked at her, that long, direct look she had come to rely on for its honesty. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She walked back to her guests. Somewhere across the room, Dunmore was watching her. She did not look at him. She smiled at Mrs. Whitfield from the neighboring estate, asked after her youngest daughter's schooling, and counted the minutes until she could find the words to hand Nathaniel Ashford the most frightening truth she had been carrying since before she became his wife. She had run out of time to be afraid. She had decided somewhere between the hallway and this moment that she would rather lose everything by telling the truth than keep everything by hiding it. She just had to make it to the end of dinner first. The dinner ended the way formal dinners always end when something unsaid has been circling the table all evening, with too much politeness and not enough air. Eleanor said the right things to the right people at the right moments, and she smiled until her face ached with it, and she watched Dunmore from the corner of her eye, the way you watch a dog you don't trust near an open gate. He didn't move on her. He talked to the magistrates. He accepted a second glass of port. He laughed at something the assemblyman said. But his eyes kept finding her across the room, with that same quiet calculation, and she understood that he was not finished. He was waiting. Men like Dunmore were always waiting for the moment when the room was most full, the damage most permanent, the audience most useful. She was not going to give him that moment. The last carriage left at 9:30. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the lanterns disappear down the drive and felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who has held herself together by will alone for 5 hours straight. Her shoulders hurt. Her jaw hurt. The back of her neck felt like a fist that had forgotten how to open. She heard Nathaniel behind her speaking to one of the servants, and then the sound of the front door closing, and then his footsteps. She turned. "The study," she said. "Please." He nodded once and led the way. She shut the door behind them. The fire had burned low. The room smelled like old books and the particular kind of quiet that only comes after a long noise has stopped. She stood in the middle of the room and did not sit down because she had learned a long time ago that hard things were harder to say from a chair. "I have to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Nathaniel leaned against the edge of the desk, arms not crossed, body not closed. He simply waited with the particular patience of a man who had decided he was going to listen before he decided anything else. She pulled the letter from where she had tucked it against her side. She had retrieved it from the correspondence box before the guests arrived, some part of her knowing that tonight was the night whether she was ready or not. She held it out. He took it. She watched him read. She watched his face for every movement, every tightening, every change in the set of his jaw, the way she had once watched ledgers for errors, carefully looking for the thing that would tell her what she actually needed to know. He read it twice. She could tell by the pause at the bottom of the page. Then he lowered it. "When did you get this?" he said. "2 years before we were married." Her voice was steady. She had worked to make it steady. "After the fever." The physician was careful. He said possible, not certain. He said it was a caution, not a verdict. "But you knew before the wedding." "Yes." The word sat between them, small and heavy as a stone. "Why didn't you tell me?" She had rehearsed this answer a dozen times in her head, and every version had sounded like an excuse. So she gave him the truth without dressing it. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Not of you specifically, of what I would become the moment you knew. I would have been a problem to be evaluated, a risk to be weighed, and I had spent my entire life being evaluated and weighed, and I wanted just once to be known before I was judged." Nathaniel was quiet. "And tonight," he said. "Why tonight?" "Because Dunmore knows about the letter. Someone in the household told him. He was going to use it before the evening ended, and I would rather you hear it from me than from a lawyer standing in your dining room in front of 40 people. The firelight moved between them. "That was the right choice," Nathaniel said. His voice was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was the voice of a man still processing, still moving through something large and complicated, and not yet on the other side of it. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," Eleanor said. "I'm not asking you to say it doesn't matter. It does matter. I understand that. But I need you to know that I never intended to deceive you. I intended to survive long enough for you to know me. And I—" Her voice caught just briefly and she pressed through it. "I think you do know me. Now. A little." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the letter on the desk. "The physician said possible," he said. "Yes. Not certain." "Not certain," he breathed. "And Dunmore is going to argue misrepresentation. He'll try. He needs the letter and a witness who'll confirm I knew before the wedding. Rebecca is the most credible option." She paused. "But Rebecca told me tonight that she is not their instrument. I believe her." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression at the mention of his sister. He looked away toward the low fire, and she could see him calculating not against her. She didn't think, but through something, working out the shape of what he was standing in. "Rebecca came tonight," he said. "Yes." "That surprised me." "It surprised me too." Eleanor folded her hands. She was going to apologize. I think she still means to. He was quiet again. The kind of quiet she had learned meant he was deciding something. "Go to bed," he said finally. "I need to think." It wasn't a dismissal. She could hear the difference now. It was a man asking for room to work through something without an audience, even her. "All right," she said. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he said her name. "Eleanor." She turned. He was looking at her from across the room with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled politeness, and not the careful warmth she'd been watching develop over the past weeks. Something older than those things. Something that had been underneath them the whole time. "Thank you for telling me yourself," he said. She nodded. She could not speak. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, and thought about the letter on the study desk, and the look on his face, and all the ways tomorrow could go. She had told herself she was prepared for any of them. She had told herself that she had made her choice and the rest was not in her hands. She was not prepared. She was terrified. At some point before dawn, she heard him on the stairs, heard him stop in the hallway outside her door. A long pause, long enough that she held her breath. Then his footsteps continued down the hall to his own room. She breathed. She told herself that was not a verdict. She told herself that a man who had decided to end something did not stop in hallways. She was still telling herself that when the sun came up. Dunmore moved the next morning. She found out through Abigail, who found out through the stable boy, who had overheard a conversation between Dunmore and Mrs. Hargrove's carriage driver before they left the previous evening. Dunmore had sent a letter by express rider to Richmond before breakfast. He had filed a preliminary inquiry with the county clerk regarding the Ashford estate entailment. He had done it without the letter. without Rebecca. He had done it on the basis of testimony from a member of the Ashford household staff. Eleanor went to find Nathaniel immediately. He was already in the office. He was already reading a copy of the clerk's inquiry. She didn't know how he'd gotten it so fast, and she didn't ask. He looked up when she came in. "I know," he said. "Who was the staff member?" "Martha Glidden, the upstairs housemaid." His voice was flat. "She's been with the household for 12 years. She was loyal to Rebecca, not to the estate." He paused. "She's been let go." Eleanor absorbed that. "And the inquiry is worth exactly as much as a preliminary inquiry is worth, which is very little without corroborating evidence." He set the document down. He needs the letter. He needs a family member to testify. Without those two things, his case is a rumor wearing legal clothing. He'll keep looking. Yes. Nathaniel looked at her. "Which means we need to stop looking like a house that can be picked apart." "And how do we do that?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said, "dealt with problems by controlling information. He kept everything locked down, revealed nothing, trusted no one. He thought that was how you protected a family name." He picked up a pen, turned it in his fingers. "He died with 4 people in that house who actually liked him." Eleanor waited. "I don't want to do it that way," Nathaniel said. He looked up at her. "I want to answer Dunmore publicly. I want to call a meeting of the county board and address the inquiry directly. No hiding, no legal maneuvering. Just the truth in a room in front of people who matter." Eleanor went very still. "The truth," she said carefully, "includes the letter." "Yes. If you bring the letter into a public proceeding, then it's on record on our terms, not his." His jaw was set. If Dunmore reveals it in Richmond through back channels, the story is, wife deceived husband, family is in crisis, estate is vulnerable. If we address it directly, I stand beside you. I state clearly that I am aware of the physician's letter, and that I consider it a private medical matter and not relevant to the estate's stability. The story is different. Eleanor looked at him. "You would do that?" she said. Not a question. A thing she was hearing for the first time, and needing to say out loud to believe it. "It's your marriage too," he said. "It's your name now, and I am done letting other people write the story of this house." Her throat tightened. She breathed through it. "There's a risk," she said. "If you stand up publicly and defend the marriage, and then if the physician's caution turns out to be correct, people will say you were foolish, that you chose badly." "People have been saying that since June," he said dryly. "I've adjusted." Something moved through Eleanor that she did not have a clean word for. It was not relief exactly. It was something that had been compressed for a very long time, suddenly finding room. "All right," she said, "then we do it your way." The county board met on a Tuesday. Nathaniel had requested the session himself, which gave him the floor first and the advantage of framing. Eleanor sat beside him at the long table in the county hall, not behind him, not to the side in the gallery where wives usually sat when their husbands conducted business. Beside him at the table because he had asked her to be there and she had said yes without hesitating. Dunmore was present. Mrs. Hargrove was not, whether from strategy or embarrassment, Eleanor didn't know. Nathaniel spoke for 15 minutes. He did not read from notes. He spoke the way he did when he was certain of something quietly, directly, without performance. He addressed the inquiry point by point. He presented the corrected estate accounts. He documented the tenant improvements, the household reorganization, the school fund, the corrected wage records. He laid out 6 months of actual management in language precise enough that the county clerk was writing continuously. And then he said, "I am aware that Mr. Dunmore's inquiry rests in part on a question about medical correspondence that my wife received before our marriage. I want to address that directly." The room shifted. Eleanor kept her spine straight. "My wife received a letter from a Boston physician in 1815 expressing a possible, not certain possible concern about her health following an illness. She did not disclose this letter before our marriage. I was not aware of it until last week." He paused. "I am aware of it now, and I want to be clear about what I consider it to mean." Every person in the room was listening. "It means my wife was 23 years old and frightened," Nathaniel said. "It means she was entering a marriage she had not chosen, in a state she had not chosen, carrying a fear she had no framework to share with a man she did not yet know. I do not consider that deception. I consider that human." He looked at Dunmore without inflection. "I am not challenging my marriage. I am not seeking relief from my marriage. I am stating for the record and before this board that I stand by my wife, I stand by this estate, and I consider this inquiry to be without merit." Silence. Dunmore opened his mouth. "Mr. Dunmore." The circuit judge, who had been at the dinner Thursday and had watched the whole evening with the careful attention of a man used to reading rooms, spoke from the far end of the table. "Do you have evidence beyond the preliminary inquiry?" A pause. "At this time," Dunmore began. "Evidence," the judge repeated. "Not inference. Evidence." Another pause. "No," Dunmore said. "Then I suggest we adjourn this and allow the Ashford estate to continue its business without further interruption." The judge closed his folder. "This board has more pressing matters." It was over in 30 seconds. Eleanor breathed for the first time in what felt like an hour. Outside the county hall in the bright summer heat, she stood beside Nathaniel while the other board members filed past, and she thought about everything she wanted to say to him and couldn't find the beginning of any of it. He spoke first. "You're quiet," he said. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." "Nathaniel," she turned to face him. "You stood up in there and defended me in front of the county board. You put your name beside mine in a public proceeding and told a room full of people that you consider my fear to be human." Her voice was steady, but barely. "I need you to know that I understand what that cost you." He looked at her for a moment. "It didn't cost me what you think it did," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he stopped, started again, the way he sometimes did when he was being careful about precision. "My father cared more about the Ashford name than he cared about any actual person connected to it. I watched that my whole life. I watched it cost him everything that mattered and preserve everything that didn't." He met her eyes. "I don't want to be that man, and I wasn't today." Eleanor looked at him. "Was that the first time you've said that out loud?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "I think it was." She nodded slowly. The sun was very bright. Somewhere on the road behind them, a horse was moving past at a trot, and the sound of it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and the world felt for this moment extraordinarily large and strangely manageable. "I'm not going to stop being afraid," she said. "About the letter, about what it might mean. I can't promise you certainty." "I know. I need you to know that I know that's not fair to you." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, "when was the last time either of us was promised fair?" She looked at him, and she felt it, the thing she had been careful not to name for weeks, the thing she had kept at arm's length, the way you keep a fire at arm's length, when you don't yet know how big it's going to get. She felt it with a clarity that was almost frightening. She was in love with her husband. She had not planned on that. She was not sure what to do with it yet. "Come home," he said. Simple as that. Not a command, an invitation. The difference mattered to him, she could tell, and the fact that it mattered to him was part of why she felt what she felt. "Yes," she said. They went home. That evening Rebecca came, not with trunks or demands, or the particular energy of a woman making an entrance. She came quietly in a simple carriage, with a single bag, and an expression that had none of her usual architecture, no performance, no precision, no careful construction. Just a woman who looked tired and older than she had a month ago. Eleanor opened the door herself. Rebecca looked at her. "I heard what happened at the board." "Yes. I didn't go to Dunmore," Rebecca said. "I want you to know that. He tried. I refused." "I know." Eleanor stepped back. "Come inside." Rebecca came in. They sat in the small parlor. Not the formal one, the one Eleanor had claimed as her own. The one with the better light, and Abigail brought tea without being asked, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then Rebecca said, "I was afraid of you." Eleanor waited. "Not of you personally, of what you represented." Rebecca held her cup with both hands. "This house was mine to manage for 4 years. I knew every account, every tenant, every servant, every obligation. And then Nathaniel brought home a woman from Boston I'd never met, and I was reduced, overnight, without anyone asking." She looked at Eleanor directly. "That is not your fault, I know that. But I made you pay for it anyway." "You did?" Eleanor said. "I'm sorry." "I know." Rebecca looked at her steadily. "Can we— I am not asking to come back to the house. That's not what this is. I'm asking whether what I did can be not undone. I know it can't be undone, but whether it can be moved past," Eleanor said. "Yes." Eleanor looked at the woman across from her, proud and tired and genuinely uncertain in a way she had never been willing to show before, and thought about what it meant to offer something to a person who had genuinely hurt you, not because they deserved it, but because you had decided who you wanted to be. "Yes," she said. "It can be moved past." Rebecca breathed. They drank their tea. Outside, the summer evening settled over Ashford Hall with the particular gentleness of a season that has been brutal and is finally beginning to turn. Eleanor sat with her sister-in-law in the small parlor with the good light and thought, "I did not know this is what a home becomes." She was beginning to understand it now. Rebecca did not leave that night. She didn't ask to stay. She simply sat in the small parlor until the tea went cold and the candles burned low, and at some point Nathaniel came to the doorway, saw his sister sitting across from his wife, and said nothing for a long moment. Rebecca looked up at him. He looked back at her. It was not a warm reunion. It was not a cold one either. It was two people who had known each other their whole lives, standing on opposite sides of a door that had been opened by someone neither of them had expected to open it. "The East guest room is made up," Nathaniel said finally. Rebecca nodded once. "Thank you." He left without another word, but he left the door open behind him. Eleanor noticed that. She thought Rebecca noticed it too. They did not speak again that night, the three of them. But the house that had felt for months like a set of separate sealed rooms felt for the first time like a single place where more than one kind of life was being lived under the same roof. Eleanor sat with that feeling for a long time after she went to bed. It was not happiness exactly. It was something more durable than happiness. Something that had roots. She did not know yet what to call it. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything Eleanor had experienced since coming to Virginia. But it was a different kind of quiet from the silence of the first 6 months. That silence had been the quiet of rooms where no one spoke, because no one trusted what speech might cost them. This was the quiet of people who had said the hard things and were now learning what came after. Nathaniel changed in ways that were small and therefore enormous. He began consulting her before decisions, not after. Not just the ledger decisions and the tenant account decisions, but the ones that lived in the category she had once thought he kept entirely to himself. Who to invite to the estate, how to handle a dispute between two tenant families, whether to sell the east parcel of land that had been sitting fallow since his father's time. He asked her opinion, and then he actually listened to it, which was different from the performance of listening that she had grown up watching men do around her father's table. She began to trust it. That was its own kind of terrifying. Trust, she had learned, was a thing you built like a house slowly with specific materials, checking each joint before you put weight on it. She had been burned before by leaning on something that looked solid and turned out to be only for show. She was careful. She checked every joint. Every time she checked, it held. Rebecca stayed a week, then 2, then quietly stopped counting days. She did not resume management of the household that had shifted to Eleanor and stayed there by unspoken agreement and demonstrated competence. What Rebecca did instead surprised Eleanor more than anything else had. She helped, not with authority, not with the particular proprietary energy of a woman who considered everything her territory. She helped the way a person helps when they have decided to participate rather than control. She knew things about the estate Eleanor didn't, about the history of certain tenants, about the rhythm of the harvest cycle, about which local merchants could be trusted, and which ones inflated accounts when they thought no one was watching closely. She offered this knowledge without drama in the course of ordinary conversations. Like setting tools on a workbench for someone else to use, Eleanor accepted them the same way. It was not yet friendship, but it was something honest, and Eleanor had come to value honesty over warmth, where honesty was the rarer thing. A letter arrived from her father in Boston at the end of August. Thomas Whitmore wrote the way he spoke directly, practically, and with a warmth that only appeared between the lines if you knew where to look. He had heard through channels he did not specify that there had been some legal difficulty regarding the estate. He wanted to know if Eleanor needed him to come south. He noted that he had several business contacts in Richmond who might be useful. He asked after her health with 1 sentence and after the estate accounts with 4. Eleanor wrote back, "I am well. The difficulty is resolved. The accounts are in better order than they have been in years. Do not come yet. Come at Christmas. Bring the good wool coat because Virginia winters are colder than Boston winters pretend to be, and you will not believe me until you are standing in it." She did not tell him about the letter. She did not tell him about the board. She told him that she was beginning to understand the house she lived in and that she thought she was going to be all right. It was the truest thing she had written to him since the wedding. Nathaniel read it over her shoulder before she sealed it. She had started leaving correspondence unsealed when he was nearby a small thing that had become a signal between them. "For this is not a secret from you." He read it. He did not comment on the content. But when he walked away, he rested his hand on her shoulder for a moment, briefly warm and certain. She sat with the warmth of it longer than she was ready to admit. The thing between them was moving in a direction that neither of them had named yet. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, not by seeing it, but by the pressure in the air, by the way small things behaved differently, the way he looked for her when he came into a room, the way she listened for his step on the stairs in the morning before she was even fully awake, the way conversations that used to end when the business was done now kept going sideways and slow into territory that had nothing to do with ledgers or tenants or Hargrove lawyers. She was not ready to name it. She was also running out of reasons not to. It broke open on a Wednesday evening in September, without warning, without any of the staging she might have expected from a moment that size. She was in the estate office. He came in, sat down across from her, and said, "I want to talk about the letter." Eleanor set her pen down. "All right," she said. "Not the legal part, not the board, not Dunmore, not the entailment." He leaned forward, arms on the desk. "The actual letter. What it says. What it means to you." She looked at him. "Why now?" "Because I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I'd rather have the conversation than keep thinking about it alone." That was the most Nathaniel thing he had ever said to her. "I'm afraid," she said, simply, because she had decided sometime between the county board and this moment that she was done dressing her truth in careful language. "Not every day, but enough. I think about it when I see Mrs. Pickett's children in the tenant yard. I think about it when Rebecca mentions her nieces. I think about it at night sometimes when the house is quiet." She met his eyes. "And I'm afraid that the fear itself is a kind of answer. That the fact that I worry about it means something." "It means you're paying attention," he said. "It doesn't mean it's true." The physician said possible. His voice was level. "That is not a verdict. I have read that letter 4 times now, and it does not say what fear has been telling you it says." Eleanor was quiet. "I'm not trying to minimize it," he said. "I'm telling you that I read it as a man and not as a family obligation, and what I read was a caution from a careful doctor to a young woman after a serious illness, and nothing more definitive than that." He paused. "Whatever happens, whatever is possible or not possible, I need you to hear that it does not change what is true right now." "And what is true right now?" she asked. He held her eyes. "That this is your house," he said. "That you have made it better than it was. That I look for you when you're not in the room and I find the room lacking." He said it the way he said everything important, without decoration, without performance. Just the fact of it laid down. "I did not expect you, Eleanor. I expected a Boston wife with good manners and a useful dowry, and I got you. And I don't know entirely what to do with that yet, but I know I don't want to do without it." The fire had gone low. The room was very still. Eleanor breathed. "I love you," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Or perhaps she had decided and just not informed the rest of herself. Either way, it was out clear and plain, the plainest thing she had said in this room full of honest conversations. Nathaniel looked at her. Something moved across his face, slow like weather, like a man who has been cold for a long time, feeling the first real warmth, and taking a moment to be certain it's real, before he trusts it. "I know," he said. She laughed. Unexpected, involuntary, startled out of her. "That is a terrible response. I'm not finished." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know, because I've been watching you for 4 months, and I know what you look like when you're being careful. And I know what you look like when you've stopped being careful, and for the last 3 weeks, you have looked at me the way I have been looking at you since approximately the evening you told me this was your house." He leaned forward. "I love you, Eleanor. I did not plan on it. I am not sorry." She could not speak. He stood, came around the desk, held out his hand. She took it. That was all. No grand gesture. No speech. Just her hand in his, in the estate office, in the quiet of a September evening, and the particular kind of certainty that doesn't need any more words than the ones already spoken. It should have been the end of the difficulty. It nearly was. What came instead was October, and with October came a letter from Dunmore that none of them had expected. He had found a second physician, not the Boston doctor who had written the original letter, a different one, a Richmond physician named Harwell who had apparently treated Eleanor briefly during a visit to the city 2 years prior, and who was now prepared to submit a written statement regarding her medical history. Eleanor had not remembered the Richmond visit as significant. She had had a brief illness fatigue, a persistent cough, and her aunt with whom she had been staying had called a doctor who had examined her for 30 minutes and prescribed rest and willow bark tea. She had recovered within the week. She had not thought of it since. Dunmore had found him. She did not know how. She did not ask. What mattered was that the inquiry she had believed was closed was open again with a new thread, and that thread ran through a doctor she barely remembered seeing in a city she had only visited twice. She told Nathaniel immediately. He read the notice from the clerk's office and was quiet for a long time. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Depends on what Harwell actually says." He set the paper down. A physician's opinion is not a diagnosis. It is certainly not evidence of misrepresentation. But Dunmore is building a pattern. First letter, second physician next, he'll find a servant or a neighbor or someone who will testify to some private conversation. He looked at her. He's not going to stop. Then we don't let him set the terms. Eleanor stood. "I want to go to Richmond." He looked at her. "I want to speak to Dr. Harwell directly," she said. "Not through a lawyer, not through a letter, directly." Eleanor. "Nathaniel." She held his gaze. "Every time this has gotten worse, it has gotten worse because someone else was telling my story. I am done with that." Her voice was firm, not angry. The firmness of a woman who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. "Let me go speak to him. Let me tell him who I am and what happened in that office and what his statement will do to a family that is just finally finding its footing." A long pause. "I'm coming with you," he said. "I know," she said. "I was counting on it." They rode to Richmond in 3 days. Dr. Harwell turned out to be a small, serious man in his 60s who had the look of someone who had been practicing medicine long enough to be tired of being used for other people's legal purposes. He received them in his office, looked at the clerk's notice, looked at Eleanor, looked at Nathaniel, and said, "I wondered when someone would actually come speak to me, rather than simply sending letters requesting statements." "What did you tell them?" Eleanor asked. "I told them I treated a young woman for fatigue and a cough in the autumn of 1815, and that she recovered fully within a week." He set the notice aside. "I did not speculate about her medical history beyond what I had actually observed. I do not make a habit of speculation." Dunmore suggested you were prepared to submit a statement about her long-term health. Harwell looked distinctly unimpressed. "Mr. Dunmore told me that my professional opinion would be valuable in a legal matter involving the Ashford estate. I told him that my professional opinion is based on clinical observation, not on what a lawyer finds useful." He looked at Eleanor directly. "Mrs. Ashford, I remember you. You were ill and then you were well. That is the entirety of my medical knowledge regarding your case." Eleanor breathed. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" Nathaniel said. "I already have," Harwell said, and produced a sealed document from his desk. "I wrote it this morning. I assumed someone with actual standing would come eventually." He handed it to Nathaniel. "Good day." They were back in the carriage before Eleanor trusted herself to speak. "He wrote it this morning," she said. "He knew someone would come." Nathaniel looked at the sealed document. "He was waiting for us to come ourselves instead of sending lawyers." "He was waiting to see if we were real," Eleanor said. Nathaniel looked at her. "What? Whether we were real people or just legal positions?" She looked at the document. "He needed to see us before he decided who to help." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Then it's good we came," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Dunmore's inquiry collapsed before Christmas. Without Harwell's testimony, without Rebecca's cooperation, without anything beyond a preliminary filing, and a hostile household maid whose credibility had been considerably damaged by the circumstances of her dismissal, the Hargrove legal effort dissolved. The way such efforts dissolve, when they are built on pressure, rather than evidence quietly, without acknowledgement, as if it had never been quite serious to begin with. Mrs. Hargrove sent a letter in November. It was brief and carefully worded and contained neither apology nor admission, but it wished Eleanor well, in a way that was for Mrs. Hargrove the closest thing to a white flag that Eleanor was ever likely to receive. She accepted it in the spirit it was intended, and wrote back a reply that was equally brief and equally careful and equally final. She did not keep the letter. She did not need a record of that particular victory. The village school opened in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in a building that had once been a storage barn, and was now something considerably warmer and better lit, thanks to a fund that Eleanor had established in September with money from the corrected estate accounts, and a donation from her father that arrived with a letter saying simply, "I always believed in the things you care about." She had cried reading that. Just briefly. In the small parlor with the good light by herself, because some things deserved a moment of privacy. The opening day brought 43 children. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched them file in noisy and uncertain and intensely curious. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for so long she had forgotten what settled felt like. Nathaniel stood beside her. 43, he said. "The Pickett boys are in the back row," she said. "I can tell because they have the same ears." He laughed. She heard it the way she heard everything about him now fully without the protective distance she used to keep. It landed and stayed. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the school specifically, for all of it. For the board and the letter on the desk, and the hand she had taken in the estate office, and the 3 days to Richmond, and the look on his face when he had said, 'I love you, Eleanor, I am not sorry.'" He understood. He always understood the things she didn't finish. "Thank you," he said back. "Same reason, all of it." They stood in the doorway of the school and watched 43 children settle into their seats, and outside the winter light was thin and cold and clear, and Ashford Hall stood at the end of the drive the way it always had 400 acres and 3 generations, and all that history, and none of it was different, and all of it was entirely changed. Rebecca joined the school's board of trustees in January. She did it without announcement by simply appearing at the first meeting and sitting down and offering in her precise and knowledgeable way to manage the fund allocation. Eleanor had looked at her across the table and felt something that was not quite forgiveness. Forgiveness had happened months ago in a small parlor over cold tea. But was the thing that comes after forgiveness when you stop thinking about the wound and start thinking about the person. She said, "I'm glad you're here." Rebecca said, "I should have been here from the beginning." Neither of them said anything else about it. They did not need to. Spring came to Virginia the way it always does. Insistent green smelling like turned earth and new possibility arriving before anyone had quite finished being cold. The orchard came into bloom. The tenant quarter was quieter and more prosperous than it had been in years. The household ran with the particular efficiency of a place where people understood their work mattered and were treated accordingly. Eleanor was in the garden one morning when Nathaniel found her. She was standing at the edge of the kitchen herb beds, which had been her project since March, and were now something she was quietly proud of, and he came and stood beside her with his coat open and his hat in his hand, the way he did when he had been working, and stopped mid-thought to come find her. "Abigail told me something this morning," he said. Eleanor looked at him. His face was doing something she had not seen before. Not the controlled version, not the careful version. Something that had gotten past all of that and was simply purely terrifyingly visible. She said, "Eleanor." He stopped, started again. "She says you may be with child." The garden was very quiet. The morning light was coming in sideways and warm, and Eleanor felt it on her face and breathed and looked at her husband and thought about the letter she had carried for 3 years and the fear she had lived inside and the physician who had said possible, not certain, and all the distance between a caution and a verdict. "She might be right," Eleanor said. Nathaniel looked at her. She looked back at him. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision sometime in the last 30 seconds. She was going to stand in her kitchen garden in the April light with her husband and feel this thing, this enormous, terrifying, completely unplannable thing, without collapsing under it and without pretending it was smaller than it was. "I don't know yet," she said. "We don't know yet." "No," he said. "We don't." But he agreed. He reached out and took her hand. Not urgently, not with the particular weight of a man grabbing at something he is afraid to lose. Steadily, the way he did everything that mattered with intention and without performance. She held on. She thought about the woman she had been the morning Rebecca Ashford called her a womb with a fortune attached. Sitting at the breakfast table with her hands folded and her tea untouched and her dignity held together by nothing but will, convinced that the best she could hope for was to be tolerated in the house where she had been placed. She thought about who she was now. She managed the accounts of a 400-acre estate and had corrected 3 years of financial irregularities. She had built a school. She had spoken her truth in a hallway and at a county board table and in an estate office by firelight to the man holding her hand. She had made an enemy of a Hargrove lawyer and an ally of her husband's sister. She had ridden to Richmond and spoken to a physician and refused every single time to let someone else tell her story. She was Eleanor Whitmore Ashford. And she was not a function or a bargain or a womb or a fortune. She was the woman who had looked at every expectation this state and this society and this family had placed on her and had chosen every single time to be something more than what they were asking for. That did not change with a child or without one. It never had. Nathaniel squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. And in the April light in the garden of the house that was hers, fully, finally, without condition, Eleanor Ashford understood that she had not come to Virginia to become what anyone needed her to be. She had come here to become herself, and she had.